Matthew 14, Jesus focuses on the disciples. We've seen the structure here as we've moved through Matthew, the pattern that increasingly the opposition is getting harsher, more bitter. And Jesus' response to that in Matthew 14 extends a trend that we already began to see earlier, that Jesus will focus more privately on his disciples. You'll see kind of a split ministry, and a ministry that's public amongst the crowds, but parallel to that and separate from that, a ministry that is focused on the disciples and those who are willing to hear. Matthew 14 starts off with a kind of historical flashback to explain some of that. And the flashback here is to tell us about John the Baptist's fate. Herod the Tetrarch heard about the fame of Jesus, and he said to his servants, "This is John the Baptist. He has been raised from the dead." I would like to comment here just at a passing point. It's intriguing that Herod has some kind of grasp of the power of Jesus' ministry, the marvel of what Jesus was doing, that Herod would even consider the possibility that there might be a resurrection. And of course, this is a bit of a foreshadowing of the reality that Jesus, in fact, will rise from the dead. But the backstory as it goes on is that John had confronted Herod, and there were some historical reasons for that. Most likely, the nature of Herod's sin was so public that John was in a position where he essentially had to state something in response to it. In any case, he made the statement courageously and directly, "It is not lawful for you to have her." There's more historical details here, but what happened is that both people divorced their spouses and married each other, and they did so even though they were actually related, so it was also incestuous. It was his brother's wife, and there were all kinds of reasons that this was an unlawful marriage. But that gets worse. Because when Herod's birthday comes, he makes a promise, probably a very foolish promise, and the response from the mother who hates John is that she demands the head of John the Baptist on the platter. This would be completely unlawful, extrajudicial. And the king actually sends, and John's head is given. A bit of information, too, that helps us process what we're talking about with Herod. We can recognize this as Herod Antipas. This is not Herod the Great of Matthew chapter 2. But this is the Herod the Great's son. So Matthew chapter 2, that Herod has a son. Herod Antipas is now the same Herod who later on, according to Luke's record, will have Jesus standing before him. Remember, between Pilate and Herod, there's this back and forth. And so Jesus is actually drawn up in judgment before this very Herod later on. And I think that also gives us a bit of an appreciation for Jesus' response to all of this. Jesus withdrew as a result of Herod's actions, the recognition that this is a matter of life and death. One or two other just interesting background details about Herod. We can recognize the place where Herod would have held his palace. Most likely, we're talking about Tiberias. Herod, in trying to put himself in a high place, tries to build a Roman city that would rival all of the other cities around. And so here is the city that he's built, of course, the modern city here, but right on the shores of the Lake of Galilee, Sea of Galilee, and a beautiful area, but also, as far as we can tell, in the time of Herod, very palatial. We can even find, or we have found, coinage from Herod. This is from his time and his coinage. So we're talking about a recognized historical figure with artifacts that verify his life and what he did. The point in this passage of the backstory and explaining what's happening here is that it's highlighting the issue of the time. Two purposes, really. It's showing us how high the stakes are. These are issues of life and death. And you'll notice in verse 13, it just makes the link. When Jesus heard these things, he withdrew himself from there. Why? I think part of the point is to say, there's life and death issues, and you can see that in the death of John. But there's something more. I think this foreshadows Jesus' own death. Remember, Jesus will stand before this Herod later. Both men are executed for speaking the truth. Both men are executed in a way that is absolutely extrajudicial, completely unjust. And it also gives you a very interesting insight in explaining why it took the leaders so long to kill Jesus. Remember, it's just dragging on, and they find someone to betray Jesus at the right time and so forth. And one kind of wonders, why don't they just take him? But you can see in Herod's own reservation about John, he was wanting to deal with John. He wanted, it says in verse 5, he wanted to put John to death, but he could not, he was afraid to, because it says he feared the people. They held John to be a prophet. And if that's the kind of power that John held in people's minds and hearts, and to the point that Herod, a very powerful man, actually feared putting him to death, how much more with Jesus? This helps us then understand Jesus' own betrayal later on. But the passage continues on from there. And the focus in these latter sections is that Jesus is shifting away to focus specifically on ministry to the disciples. Now, I don't want to overstate that. Within the passage, you see that Jesus feeds the 5,000. That's hardly a private ministry. But you also notice throughout kind of a pattern of Jesus stepping away. And it's with things like this, verse 13. Jesus withdrew from there in a boat to a desolate place by himself. The crowds came, they found him, they followed him on foot. But it's apparent that Jesus' intention is to go away privately. He dismisses the crowds. He goes up on the mountain by himself to pray. He was there alone. And again, you get this idea that Jesus is trying to draw away, or he does draw away from the crowds. There is this idea, I think that's important here, that Jesus is anything but a populist. It's not that he's out there seeking to try to find as many people as he can to become his followers so that he can build up a movement and so that he'll be protected from the likes of Herod and Pilate by having lots of people and being very popular. Quite the contrary, the crowds are seeking him. And Jesus is going to do faithful ministry. But it's actually his intention to go and to minister quietly. You're also going to find an interesting pattern with the disciples. And the reason I mention this pattern, just as a word to read through as you go through chapter 14, you can just highlight how many times this occurs. The disciples came to him, he gave them to the disciples, the disciples, the disciples. It's enough of a pattern in the chapter to say that we're not just seeing Jesus kind of going away by himself alone and that's it, but it's him going away to focus on the disciples. This is following the pattern that we saw in chapter 13. He gives parables publicly, and then he steps away, and he gives a private interpretation to the disciples alone, because there is an intentional, purposeful focus on them. And the last thing I would say that highlights this kind of trend is to notice the final two miracles of the chapter. So one of the miracles is one that I think we're rather familiar with already, and that's just the miracle of Jesus feeding the 5,000. But something that's interesting here, if you follow the pattern, it's not just that he fed the 5,000, but the disciples are integrally involved with this miracle. Okay, watch how this works. The disciples come to him, they bring the need. And Jesus says in response to them, well, you give them something to eat. And I think that's there, of course, Jesus knows that they can't. I think that's there for the disciples to have to process, ooh, what are we going to do here? They bring them eventually, or they bring to him the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. He takes the loaves and notice that he gives them to the disciples, and the disciples distribute to the crowds. Of course, Jesus could do this any way he wants. He could just cause the bread to appear. But I think the idea of it is that the disciples are personally and integrally involved. Now, instead of just Jesus doing a miracle and the focus of being Jesus does a miracle and the person who receives the miracle, the disciples have kind of entered into the equation. They're one of the characters now in the drama. They're part of all of this. And it's not that that it's highlighting the disciples doing the miracle, as much as the disciples take the bread, they carry the bread, they process this. And a bit later in chapter 16, Jesus will even call this to their memory. Do you remember? You did this, you saw this, you felt the bread. How many baskets were left? They're personally involved with the miracle, personally experiencing it. You see a similar pattern in the second miracle of this chapter. The disciples get in the boat, the crowds are dismissed, and when evening came, he's there alone. The disciples are in the boat on the sea, And he comes to them walking on the sea. The disciples are terrified. It's a ghost, they're crying out. Jesus speaks to them, take heart, it is I. Okay, the disciples are directly experiencing this miracle, but it becomes more dramatic still. Peter says, command me to come to you on the water. And Jesus says, come. And Peter struggles with his faith. He's afraid. He begins to sink. And he cries out, Lord, save me. Jesus reaches out his hand. Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt? He gets into the boat. Those in the boat worshipped him, saying, truly you are the Son of God. And it's, I think, illustrating my point again, that it's not just the disciples kind of disconnected from the miracles, but the disciples personally involved right in it. The last point I would like to make in this section is to talk about the disciples' faith. And there's an interesting pattern here if you want to compare. There was a very similar miracle in the past when Jesus calmed the sea. He calmed the storm. And you can see the disciples' response in that context, how they cry out. The men marveled at the end, what sort of man is this that even the winds and the sea obey him? Well, that's a kind of faith. When you get to this chapter, however, more time has gone by. And Jesus will rebuke Peter to say, oh, you of little faith. But there was at least some faith expressed in Peter's confidence that he could come to Jesus. And this last comment is the most striking. Instead of the question, what sort of man is this? Here's an affirmation. Those in the boat, which are the disciples, they worshiped him. And their confession, truly, you are the Son of God, I think foreshadowing Peter's confession in chapter 16, you are the Messiah, the Son of God. And the extraordinarily striking thing about this is that if there is any pattern across Scripture of something that is exclusive to God alone, here it is, it's one of the 10 Commandments. You will only worship God, no one else. And this is such a critical concept. It stretches across all of the Gospels, and we find it even in Jesus' own words. The temptation of Jesus was wrapped around this. Satan saying, fall down and worship me. And Jesus answered, no, you will only worship the Lord your God. Only God is worthy of worship. Only God deserves people's worship. But the extraordinary thing here is that they worshiped Jesus. And Jesus accepted it. Who then is this person? To answer the question of the disciples before, truly this person is the Son of God, no less than God himself, worthy of their worship. And the trend is continuing. The Pharisees reject, the crowds are confused, the disciples see and grow inch by inch, bit by bit, they grow in their faith. Until we begin to see things like this come from their mouths, a response of faith that acknowledges who Jesus is, truly God. And the challenge of Matthew 14 to all of us is that we worship at the feet of Jesus. If we count ourselves his disciples, and this is what it means, come to him, rejoice in what he's doing, take part in his work, and worship him. Truly, he is the Son of God.